2nd of February 1992. This is a recording for the Oral Archives at Trowbridge Museum. Mr Alistair Gauld, G-A-U-L-D, talking to David Neville.
Let's give it a try, see whether it's working. Yeah. I wonder if you could tell me where you were born, please.
Yes, I was born at Saltcoats, which is a seaside town, a bit like Weymouth really, on the Firth of Clyde, about 30 miles south of Glasgow.
And did you take all your education up there?
Well, not really, because we moved, when I was about 9, moved to Edinburgh, and so I suppose that's where the basic education was obtained, in Edinburgh.
And when did you come south?
In 59.
To Trowbridge?
Yes, to Trowbridge.
And this was the beginning of the mills situation for you?
Well, yes and no, in as much that I had worked in a factory connected with, well, it was a textile factory, but it was a knitwear factory in Edinburgh. And then I went to college in Galashiels to study for designing of the woven fabrics. And from there, there was just a job advertised in Trowbridge. Now, of course, in those days, a lot of the jobs, they had houses attached to them, and I was getting married, so this was the attraction to come to Trowbridge. Otherwise, I suppose I would have stayed in the border country.
And what paper was this advertised in?
It was advertised through the college in Galashiels.
Oh, I see.
And because there is a tradition that many of the cloth designers came from Galashiels, and so the factories tended to contact the college direct.
And what factory was this then?
This was McCalls.
And which mill was that?
Well, McCalls basically was in the one unit, although it called itself Upper and Victoria Mills. But certainly by 1959 it was all within the bounds of one ownership and one factory, which is of course where the Tesco building is at the moment.
And this was a designing job?
Yes,
on the core?
It was, that's right.
Could you tell me a little bit about the actual designing you did, how you started, where it came from, what happened?
Yes, well, actually I rather jumped in at the deep end at McCalls, because the person that did the designing previously, he'd gone into hospital for an operation on his hips, and so when I got there was nobody there at all to do the designing. And it's, even when you're experienced, it's very difficult to go to a different factory, because it's very much a craft industry, and you have to learn the way that they work. Even the way that they write things down varies very considerably from factory to factory. And so it was quite some time before I discovered there was nobody there that could tell me, and I had to try and pick it up from the various bits of information that were lying around. And it took me quite some time to get into the swing of it, because one has to bear in mind that when you go to college you learn the basis of all the different systems that there are, say in the worsted industry in Huddersfield, and then you've got Bradford and Galashiels and the west of England. They're all different, and so it takes quite some time to get into it.
And so what was the difference between the ones you've mentioned and Trowbridge?
Well, even in the say the sizing of the yarn that's used, they use a different measuring system.
I see.
For instance, west of England was based on what they call cuts of 320 yards to the pound for the size of the yarn, Galashiel system would be 200, and I begin to forget now what some of these other ones are.
So is this the size of the yarn, the thickness of the yarn?
Yes, that's right. It's a ratio of length
Yes.
per pound, that sort of thing. And it's an indirect measurement. And it's funny because so much of it is experience that you can visualize. If somebody says, well, we are using 24s, and you can visualize what a 24s would make. But if you're not accustomed to that numbering system, you haven't a clue what it would make. You'd have to work it out every time.
Sounds extremely strange. And how did you then design? Were you given a brief?
Well, it's a very varied thing, but there are really two basic approaches. That there's the seasonal design, where you make what are called pattern ranges, pattern blankets, where you have in mind that you're designing for, say, a particular type of client, say one of the multiples, and say you're designing for ladies' skirts or something of that nature. And so you would make up a design to be aimed at that particular market. And the approach, again, depends very much on the person, but what we tended to do was you would have to know what yarns and colours were available, and you would try to make things as suitable for the mechanics of the loom as you could. You didn't want to make it terribly awkward for them, otherwise it became expensive. And so you would say have all your different colour cards of the available yarns and colours, and you would begin by having in your mind's eye that you wanted to do a particular type of check, and so you would think, well, there would be so many threads to the inch, so you've got your set of the cloth, and the chances are you would use a cloth setting which you'd used before, and then you would start putting your colours together and say, well, you'd have 24 threads of that, 10 of that, 2 of that, and so on, and you write it down, your warp pattern, and then you would do another one until you had 6 different colourways. Now, that would then be given to the warper that was going to warp that, and so they would do that, and then it would be beamed off, and it would go into the loom, and you would either you might put the same colours in the weft, or you might have different wefts depending what the purpose was, what you were trying to achieve.
So this would go onto a small loom as a trial?
No, it went onto a full-size loom.
Onto a full size?
Yes, because the patterns were they were the full width, you see, because you finish up at about 8 inches of each. Well, a little more, 6/48, so it was slightly more than that. But it was a full-sized loom, and because of sending out lots and lots of patterns to different people, you found that in fact you needed about 20 yards of this warp to have enough, even just to sample the thing.
So you never drew it down on paper? Was it all worked?
It was never
just on
coloured.
the switch?
Very, very rarely coloured on paper, simply because even if you do that, it doesn't look the same, because I don't know if you know what woven pattern designs look like on paper.
Square paper? The
squared paper, yes. Well, of course, what appears on the squared paper isn't necessarily what appears in the loom. And it might give you a bit of a hint. Certainly some designs, if it was, say you were doing a diamond design, it would obviously look like a diamond on the paper. But there are many effects which don't look the same on paper.
So actually you were working in the abstract?
Yes, mainly in the abstract, yes. But although you're working in the abstract, you are working from the experience of having done something previously.
Yeah.
And it's very evident when you're doing it that things progress. One person might do something and somebody else looks at it and thinks, oh yes, I could use that, and progresses to another version of the same thing.
So there were more than one designer eventually within McCalls?
Well, there was a variety of things. Sometimes there was one, sometimes there was two, sometimes at one point there was even three, which was a bit of an accident rather than anything else. It was when Clark's folded.
I see.
That one of their designers, he had a couple of years to go before retirement, and he came along and joined me for a little while. But I was the only one that actually was there from 59 virtually to
until
the end.
the end. And where the end was?
Well, the end was 74 really. It took some time to tail down, and I left just before the very end. There was still a little bit to do because I went off to the blanket factories in Whitney.
Did you?
Yeah,
I see.
And well, I suppose I might have been there now had it not been for the fact we couldn't sell the house. And I thought, well, it was going to be easier to get another job than to sell the house.
And what do you do now?
I work in local government.
In local government?
Yes.
Right. So may I take you back to perhaps 1968?
Yeah.
When it all was beginning to perhaps look a little difficult, was it? Or did it start?
No, the
there?
60s were very good. The 60s, I would say, looking back on it, were probably the real boom time for designing in the times of Mary Quant and people such as her. And I don't think it's ever been quite so good since. Certainly, although I'm not at all involved with it now, looking at what appears in the shops, it seems terribly dull. And I can only imagine that designing jobs must be extremely boring now.
It's done in a totally different way.
Yes.
Done on paper.
Yes.
So would Mary Quant come along and look at your patterns? Would she come in eventually and say, I want this, require this colour?
No, she wouldn't as such, although various lesser persons would do. But the sales staff, because we had a sales office in London, they would call on such establishments as hers, and they would present the various things, ideas that we had produced, and they would also be given ideas from the making up side, and they would bring something back which might be in an entirely different fabric that we couldn't possibly make, and say, well, can you make anything like that? And that was the second approach.
And was it possible at times to make materials they required?
Oh yes,
or
very
did
often.
you alter them? No.
Oh, well, no, you altered it to your own line.
Yeah.
It was always an adaptation, because supposing it was it might have been knitted for a start, and so you could try to make something which had a similar appearance, but in a fabric that you were going to be able to make.
If you went back in your mind now to the beginning in your introduction to Gauld, how large an area were you involved in? Were you involved with just the studio area, or whatever design area it was called? Or were you welcome to go and see all the processes, or see all cloth going through?
Well, you were certainly involved in the whole process, although because of it being something of a craft industry, there was a certain amount of jealousy regarding the various other departments. I think somebody would always think you were after their job,
Yes.
simply because there was a tendency for designers to become managers.
Really?
It was a fairly logical progression. Well, you see, they were in contact with the customer, and they actually had control over what was produced, so it was fairly logical. Nonetheless, with respect to McCalls, it didn't actually happen, because the manager had been there as a boy in the finishing side, and so that was just what happened in that particular setup. Now, but having said that, yes, you had to know about all the other processes, because it was so much, well, it governed what the end product was going to be.
Yes, indeed. How many machines would there have been in? Would you
Funny, I was trying
make
to
a
think.
statement, an estimate of that?
I was trying to think about that yesterday as to how many looms there were, and I vaguely remember that there must have been about 100 looms, and I was trying to think just where they all were. As far as I can remember, there must have been certainly 36 Dobcross automatics, probably about 46 single pick Dobcross, and then in another shed there was another 8 single pick Dobcross that were used for patterns as well, and there was another 2, so it was certainly getting on for 100. And then latterly we went on to the high speed looms. We had a couple of snook looms, as Belgian rapier looms, and a couple of summits. And then, very much later, really into 1971 or 2 even, we had some more summits, and I can't remember, but I think it was at least 6 of these rapier looms.
And they worked, what, 3 times as fast?
Not 3 times as fast, no. Twice as fast. That is, that they were putting the picks in twice as fast, although it doesn't actually mean that you get double the production.
No.
It's a funny equation, because your downtime is greater.
I see, yes. Yeah. And we were talking yesterday to someone who was twisting on.
Oh yes, yeah.
Did you twist on it?
Yes, very much so. Yes, you tried to get it so that you could have a twist on if you possibly could, because twisting on took about, well, between 1.5 and 2.5 hours, or it might take more if it was a very fine cloth, whereas to actually redraw something would take you all day, maybe 2 days.
I see. So that's knotting on, redrawing, is it?
No, redrawing is not it. It's actually taking every thread and taking a hook, threading it through an eyelet and pulling it through, and then putting it through the sleigh as well, and then the whole lot is put back in the loom. So it's a very slow process.
But twisting and knotting is done on the machine.
It's actually done, yes, it doesn't have to be done actually in the machine, but it usually was. The girls would climb into the loom, and we'd just sit there with a little tin of paste, or they used oil in McCalls mostly, although 1 or 2 people used paste. They just have an oil can and squirt it on the thread, and take them, twist them, and just break them off. It was quite remarkable to do it. And that was strong enough to actually pull it through all the eyelets.
Let's take it. Now, if I might ask you about the unions, were there unions at McCalls?
No, there were no unions, although I believe that one person, or possibly 2, did belong to a union somewhere, but it certainly was not at all evident, and would have been very strongly opposed, I'm quite sure, by the boss. Although there was no union at McCalls, they were aware when there were union negotiations for wage settlements, and they usually did follow suit and come into line with whatever outside influences there were in that respect. But it was very much a feudal system, and it really like something out of Dickens in many respects.
So could you give me a small structure of the feudal system?
Oh yes, well, obviously you would know that the mill was owned by the Hammonds, at that time certainly, and there was what was known as Old Man Hammond, and then, but he tended not to be there very often, and it was basically run by Roger Hammond, who's still alive. And
was that a son?
Yes, he was a son. And then you had the general manager, that was Arthur Clark. I'm afraid he's dead now. And then you had, well, you had the various heads of departments after that, in a way that you had the blender, and you had the dyer, you had the designer, and the shed manager. That was the basic setup, and then you would have the foreman.
It was the pyramid.
It was a pyramid, yes. But although it was a pyramid, it was rather, it didn't flow like that. It went like that.
A squashed pyramid.
A squashed pyramid, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
They were very strong, the owners.
Oh, very much so, yes. What they said was low. Although, from a designer's point of view, they never interfered from the design point of view. They'd interfere with absolutely everything else. You couldn't move the chairs in the office, but they'd interfere. But from the design point of view, they never did, which was a curious
quite
thing.
Amazing, actually.
Yes,
because you normally get management involving high management wanting to get involved with designing.
Yes.
At that point in
It was very odd, that, and just why, I don't know. I mean, they come up with suggestions and say what they wanted, which obviously is what they're supposed to do, but the actual technicalities of it, they never interfered with at all.
You talked about the dyer.
Yes.
Is there anybody alive that you know who was in the dyeing?
Oh, very much. He retired from, he went to Whitney when I went to Whitney, and he retired about 6 months ago, and he still lives in Whitney. I've got his telephone number if you want it.
At the end, could I?
Yes.
Please? Is there anyone else?
He's the only person around that would know anything about the dyeing side of things.
What about the machine shop?
From the spinner, he's dead. The blender is dead. I expect the shed manager's gone. I haven't seen him for a long time anyway, so I imagine he's gone. There's one or two weavers around. I've seen them just occasionally. Finishing manager. Well, I did mention to Linda Wrigley about George. Forgotten his name now.
Someone has just phoned in who was an engineer. Is that the gentleman?
No. Well, he wasn't an engineer. There was the mill manager, George. Oh dear. I went round to see him. I can't remember his name. No. But he was the foreman in the finishing side. There's one or two people that used to be in the mending that are around. that I think is about it.
That's about it. Could I, there was one point that you, when you first started, you said, of course, there was a house went with the job.
Indeed, yes.
Now, this sounds to me as though it were a most important part of life, obviously, was getting a house.
That's right, yes.
Could you tell me a little, they're not financial, but could you tell me
Yes.
something about that?
Yes, this was quite common, and certainly McCalls had about 20 houses in and around Trowbridge, and it was quite common because it was a means of attracting people from, say, Yorkshire or from the border country to come here to offer them a house. Now, there was a bit of a catch with it because it meant that the wages were correspondingly less.
So they took it away?
In a way, they didn't give it to you in the first place. And to begin with, this was all right because it was an accepted thing until the government suddenly caught up with it and started taxing people on it. And then it became less and less attractive. So, but from the management point of view, it meant that they had even more of a hold over the people that were in their properties, which made them somewhat vulnerable in a way, because if they left the factory, they had to give up their house as well. So it was a somewhat tricky situation, that one, and that was one that I got out of fairly quickly.
The initial attraction was the house.
It was indeed.
Because you were getting married.
That's right.
Were these houses, as they were kind of being, not perks, but attractions, were they larger houses for certain people and smaller houses, or were they of similar ilk?
They were mostly of similar structure and location, but there were one or two which were slightly better than the others. And what tended to happen was that if you wanted to stay all the time in a firm's house, then as a better one appeared and you thought, oh well, that's one I could move to, the chances are you could do that.
I see.
And obviously quite a few people did. But when the mill closed, some people found that really very tricky, being in the firm's house, because of course they had to all be sold.
Yes, of course.
And some people managed to get council housing at the time, and others of course moved away and had to purchase, which became very difficult because that was at that very, very difficult time in '74. So you couldn't get a mortgage.
That's right.
You couldn't sell a house, you couldn't buy a house. It was extremely difficult for them. So nonetheless, it was extremely difficult for those that had bought. I don't know which was the best thing to have done.
It was very difficult, yeah.
It was.
If you now could go back to that kind of factory and you could describe it, was it a bright inside? It did have all these lights in the roof, didn't it? All these windows in the roof.
Yes.
Was it a light atmosphere? Was it noisy? Was it extremely busy and rushing, or was it a placid situation?
Well, I think the best description is it was Dickensian. And certainly the impression that you got when you first went in just to take the offices, they were in a filthy, yellowy railway station, brown and yellow and brown, and bits of old varnish, and really depressing looking, very antiquated. We didn't even have proper chairs in the office because we sat at a bench that had really been put in for standing at, and so the chairs were piled high with cloth to bring them up to the level that you could actually sit and write at them. And I remember I had a Windsor chair, quite an antique Windsor chair that was tied together with bits of cloth. And I think my feet rested on an old gun box, because they would have dangled about 6 inches above the ground otherwise. And
Was it up a lot of stairs?
yes, that was up an iron staircase, although you could come through the general office to get to it. And that was really quite Dickensian. The general office had the usual little window that opened, and then you might be admitted, and you could then go through the boss's office, which had double doors on it, both sides, and with green felt on them, and then out into the design office side. And that building wasn't actually attached directly to the weaving sheds. You had to go down the stairs and out into the yard, and then into the weaving sheds, which were the typical sheds with a sawtooth roof.
Yes.
In the north,
Yes.
or north, there were actually more northeast facing roof lights on them, with a plaster falling off the laths and the roofs leaking, glass falling about, and very, very noisy. And you couldn't stand the noise at first, but you did become a bit used to it, because I think it knocked the edge off your hearing. And then well, our other processes, of course, were not anything like as noisy. It was basically the weaving was the noise producing end of things. And well, it was typical factory of its time.
Yeah, of its time.
Yeah.
What was, do you think, was the cause of the decline and the real decline in Trowbridge at that point? Because you were going quite a long while into 76.
Oh yes, it wasn't
a
lack of work. We had plenty of work when we finished. I think it was I can only assume it was money. Instead of it being that here was a factory producing cloth and making a certain amount of profit or a certain amount of loss, whatever happened, that with assets suddenly becoming so valuable that it obviously was a big site which was worth far more than it was able to produce as a factory. But there was certainly plenty of work when...
That's interesting, you see, because I came into Trowbridge, just realised there were mills, and when I felt that there was no work.
I see.
One felt that there was just no work, and so they closed.
No, we had plenty of work, and it took a long time to actually close the mill, because it was a little bit awkward, really. When it was decided that they wanted to sell up the mill, we had a good order book, and so there were two alternatives. They could actually run it right down, or they could try and sell the order book. Well, they got somebody who was interested in the order book, somebody from Yorkshire, but they wouldn't buy the order book unless I went with it, because of course I might have gone somewhere else. And so they said to me, did I want to go to Yorkshire to this particular mill? And I thought, well, I'm not very keen to, because the mills were closing at the rate of one a week, even there. And I thought I might just be jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. So I said, well, I'm not very keen, but they insisted that I went up with the family and had a look at their factory and a look at the Bradford, Pudsey, Leeds area, see whether we wanted to live there. And so we went up and had a look at this. And I honestly didn't feel what they were proposing was a very viable proposition, because they were making government cloths and they were wanting to go into the fancy trade. Now, they didn't have the right setup for the fancy trade, so I felt that it might be one of these things where I went there, moved everything, and then found I was back to square one. So I didn't accept it, and that rather soured things a bit, and well, that's what happened.
That's what happened. Thank you. Thank you very much.